أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
All right, I hope everybody can hear me all right. So today I want to talk about Marwan bin al-Hakam. And there's this very famous picture of a coin that we have from his reign, and it says on it, Bismillah, la ilaha illallah. It says Muḥammad Rasulullah. And you can see he's got what looks like long hair and a beard, traditional Arab clothing, a sword, maybe to say that he's a conqueror, and that's a gold dinar. And so my favorite source for classical, Islamic history, early Islamic history is Tārīkh al-Ṭabarī, which I have right here. Hope you can see it just fine. I know sometimes the software there can mess it up a little bit, but hopefully you guys can see it all right. So yeah, I want to talk about Marwan bin al-Hakam, the successor to basically Muawiyah II, which I talked about in the last video, which primarily focused on Yazid bin Muawiyah. And I'm going to play a video from Hugh Kennedy, where he talks about the transition from the Sufyanids to the Marwanids.
There are two phases, if you like, of the Umayyad Caliphate, and they are rather different in character. Some of this is stuff I've talked about before, but we can talk about the Sufyanids in that Anglophone way, Sufyanids and the Marwanids. The Sufyanids are basically the descendants of Abu Sufyan, as you imagine. That's Muawiyah and his son Yazid, who ruled just for 3 or 4 years. And then there were 2 other very short-lived caliphs, Muawiyah II and so on, we don't need to worry about. Then the Sufyanid line died out. There was then a major crisis in the Umayyad Caliphate when it almost disappeared. I mean, it was almost a 2-generation caliphate, Muawiyah and Yazid, because with the death of Yazid, there were challenges. The Yazid had sons, but they were small boys, and apparently not very well either. We don't really know what, but they died very young. And that meant that the whole question of succession was again up in the air within the Muslim community. And we get a number of different groups trying to take power. The most important of these figures was probably Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr. I'll talk a bit more about. I'll talk about for a bit. I'll just call it Ibn al-Zubayr. And the other group were led by a person called Mukhtar. And I'll talk a little bit about both of these because they show that in this crisis of the Caliphate, there was nothing automatic about the Umayyad Caliphate continuing. It was, there were other people who had just as good claims. Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr was the son of that al-Zubayr who had been one of the closest of the Sahaba to the Prophet Muhammad. And he had been a muhajir from Mecca to Medina, right in the foundations, if you like, of the Islamic community, of the Ummah. He had, in one of the first of the civil wars, he had been defeated, and I think I'm right in saying killed, at the Battle of the Camel at the start of Ali's reign, which is not something I haven't talked about because it's not directly Umayyad material. But his son had he was Quraysh, he was living in the Haramain, I think he's actually living in Mecca, And he had a reputation for being both brave and pious, and even his enemies conceded that. And he claimed the caliphate after the death of Yazid on the basis that the caliphate should be decided amongst the leading members of the Muslim community. It shouldn't be an Umayyad family thing. Now the Umayyads had done their thing, okay. Muawiyah had been a great caliph, Yazid had been a bit less impressive. Now they were gone. Anybody, you know, it's up to other people to claim the caliphate. And he, as the son of his father, as a Sahabi himself, though he must have been quite a small boy, but nonetheless that still counts, claimed the caliphate. And his platform, if you like, was that the caliphate should be returned to Medina, that it was an anti-Syrian thing, and that the real power should be rested in Quraysh and the Sahaba and their descendants. It was an attempt to grab the caliphate back from Syria and back from the Umayyad family, to restore it, as Ibn al-Zubayr would have said, to its origins, get right back to the early Muslim community and the descendants of those first Muslims who had gathered around Abu Bakr and Umar al-Khattab. Ibn al-Zubayr attracted a lot of support, including some in Syria, but not much in Iraq. And in the end, it was clear that the Haramain, the Hijaz, you couldn't rule the Muslim world from Mecca and Medina. It was too remote. There weren't enough resources to do that. And in the end, his attempts to spread his word and his propaganda failed, and famously he was besieged in Mecca by the Umayyad troops.
And so you had Yazid bin Muawiyah pass away, and then shortly thereafter you had Muawiyah II pass away. And it's just so close together. And there was no real apparent heir to Muawiyah II. And the Islamic world plunged into chaos yet again. Muawiyah II had some siblings, but none of them had reached puberty. They were all quite young. So they weren't really a good option as an heir. And meanwhile, you still have Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who we mentioned in the previous video, who's still, rebelling against the Umayyads or trying to present an alternative caliphate. And he's the son of, Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, and he gained widespread support, gained both Egypt and Iraq at this point. As soon as Muawiyah II died, he went and jumped and grabbed some land. And really at this point, his biggest contender, or his biggest rivals, were the Khawarij, the Kharijites, who they controlled, I believe, from Oman all the way up the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula. The Azraqis controlled territory in Iran and in parts of Iraq, and you had some, Ibaldis and other, Kharijites that were in North Africa at that time. And so really everyone is kind of recognizing Ibn Zubayr as being a legitimate caliph at this point. There's a lot of people are starting to pledge allegiance to him. A lot of people see him as kind of like the next real political power that's up and coming. And really people thought, okay, this is the end of the Umayyads. Probably they would have just been called the Sufyanids, not really the Umayyads. But history panned out a little bit differently. So if you remember, Ubaydullah bin Ziyad, who caused the horrible event of Karbala, he basically gathers some dedicated soldiers and various followers, and he knows that the Zubayrids they'll not like really be in his favor, right? He's gonna lose his, government position. He's gonna lose his wealth. He's gonna lose his prestige. The Zubayrids, they're not going to let him keep his position after what happened at Karbala, for sure. And so he basically flees to Syria with his dedicated followers, and he kind of has this idea that probably the best Umayyad person to take over government would be Marwan bin al-Hakam. And so he has this idea from the very beginning, it seems like, according to a lot of the sources. And so when Ubaydullah arrives in Syria, he finds the Syrians in total disarray. Meanwhile, Marwan bin al-Hakam himself, before Ubaydullah reaches him, he's thinking to himself, well, okay, I guess I might as well pledge allegiance, give bay'ah to Ibn Zubayr, along with the other Umayyad elites, the Ashraf, the Umayyad elites. They were all thinking to give bay'ah to Ibn Zubayr. And basically, the Sufyanids lost against Ibn Zubayr. It's kind of what everyone was thinking. And there was these two big tribes, I mentioned them before in the last video. In Syria, you have Qais and Banu Kalb. Banu Kalb, they're also called Ahl al-Yemen, or just al-Yemen, or Yemenis. But Qais and Banu Kalb, they disagreed about pledging allegiance to Zubayr. So Qais, originally, they wanted to appoint Khalid bin Yazid as caliph, and that's Muawiyah's little brother, but he had not yet reached puberty. I believe the sources say he's around 9 years old at that time. So he was just very young, and, the Banu Kalb wasn't ready to do that. They were getting ready to pledge allegiance to Ibn Zubayr. But when Ubaydullah arrived to Syria, he convinced the Banu Kalb to pledge allegiance and support Marwan bin al-Hakam. And he convinced Marwan, himself, that he actually could be a real contender for the throne. And, sources say that Marwan was already in his 60s at that time, probably like 61 or 62, and which was quite old for those days. I mean, remember, we're talking about the end of the Hellenistic period, the end of late antiquity, and just kind of the beginning of the Middle Ages. So, that was pretty old. People didn't live very long at that time. So you're talking about someone who's kind of a serious elder, someone who's got a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom, somebody who would make a good leader in a sense, be a chieftain, if you will. And Marwan was certainly a reasonable choice, as he was very politically astute. He was Uthman's right-hand man and chief advisor, Uthman, the third caliph from the Khulafa al-Rashidin. And so, Marwan, he knew politics, he knew how to run an administration, he knew how to run a caliphate. However, he didn't really have connections in Syria. Remember in the last video, we talked about how he had to flee Ibn Zubayr quite hurriedly, leaving the Hijaz and going to Sham, the Levant. So he doesn't really have any connections in Syria. And he had to kind of, at this point, rely really heavily on support from Banu Kalb and Ubaydullah. And in Iraq, you also had this division between Banu Kalb and Qais, but they were called Mudar and Tamim. So if you ever hear those terms, that means Banu Kalb and Qais. And in Khurasan, they were called Rabi'a and Qais. So, the Arabs in Iraq and Khurasan, they also had this division. And so, like I mentioned, Qais was wanting to appoint Khalid bin Yazid. And so the word got around in Iraq and in Khurasan that they were going to support Khalid bin Yazid, the word got around that Banu Kalb was going to support Marwan bin al-Hakam. And so all across the Islamic world, there started to be tension and fighting regarding who's going to be the next caliph. And so there was a full-out battle that happened near Damascus between Banu Kalb and Qais. And, the Banu Kalb, they had been in the Levant for generations, whereas Qais, they were the newer arrivals from the Arabian Peninsula. And then you also had a lot of smaller tribes and non-Arabs, clients that were subsumed under these two social groups. So they weren't tribes in the strict sense of lineage, because not everybody technically, had blood lineage that goes back to these tribes. But these were two social groups, or maybe you might say political parties, that existed. So Qais and Banu Kalb, they went to all out can't talk today. Qais and Banu Kalb went to all-out warfare near Damascus, having a big battle that was known as Marj Rahiq. And the Banu Kalb won, and some say that they were smaller in number, some say they were bigger in number. But anyways, Banu Kalb won. And the Qais were slaughtered. They lost pretty brutally. And, when you have people dying like that between two rival groups, blood, death, people tend not to forget that. It caused a permanent rift between the two groups that lasted all the way until the 1800s Gregorian. So even in the 1800s, you had people from both sides that were fighting one another. So this was a rivalry between these two tribal groups that has lasted pretty much all the way until modernity. So it's a pretty serious deal there. And so I'm going to read a little bit of Hugh Kennedy's book, The Prophet and the Age of the Caliphates. I'm going to read a paragraph from it. The war had been won, but the bloody victory at Marj Rahiq had long-term consequences which were to be fatal for Syria and the Umayyads alike, because it divided Arabs of the province into two separate parties, Qais, Mudar on one side and Yemen on the other. The basic distinction between northern Qais and southern Yemen Arabs was the ancient but hitherto fairly harmless division. In theory, the allegiance of each tribe was decided according to complicated genealogies, but in practice, there were considerable confusion, and some tribes were claimed by both sides. In Umayyad times, the division was in part geographical, the Qasyi tribes being mostly settled in the northern parts of the province. The newly created Jund, or that's like military district or band of Qinasrin, and the Jazira, including the Byzantine frontier areas as far east as Armenia. Yemeni tribes occupied the steppes around Homs and Palmyra, Palestine, and the areas to the east of the Jordan Valley. It was also a division arising from the Islamic conquests. Some Yemeni tribes like the Kalb, Tanukh, Judham, and Taghlib had been in Syria before the coming of Islam, while the majority of Qaisis like Sulaim, Kilab, and Ruqayl were newly arrived from the Arabian Peninsula, many of them brought to the Jazira by Muawiyah in Uthman's reign. And the Jazira is a area by the Euphrates, between the two rivers there. Some newly arrived tribes from South Arabia, like the Kindis and Hadramis, settled in Homs, and they were joined by the Yemen group. Much of the hostility must have been the result of disputes over grazing rights. I'm sure it was more than that. Many of the Yemenis came from tribes that were still in part Christian, like the ruling house of Kalb, where Ibn Bahadel's grandfather had remained Christian until his death during Ali's Caliphate. They had also in many cases been allies of the Byzantines, and in some ways the Battle of Marj Rahit was the Battle of Yarmouk refought, with the victory this time going to the old established Assyrian tribes. The confused succession to Muawiyah II had led to the emergence of two coalitions, Qaysis supporting Abdullah bin al-Qais and Yemenis supporting Ibn Bahdal and Marwan. But the battle meant that the split continued beyond the immediate crisis. Qais had many dead to avenge, and the feud was to continue for generations. As late as the 19th century, battles were still being fought in Palestine between groups calling themselves Qais and Yemen. So you had Ibn Bahdal. He was basically kind of like the chieftain, in charge of the Yemenis, and Ben al-Kalb, and he was working along with Ubaydullah bin Ziyad to make Marwan the caliph. And then the Qaysis, they were kind of led by I believe he was a governor of Damascus at the time, Abdullah bin al-Qais, and they were trying to establish Khalid bin Muawiyah as the caliph. But as we know, that side lost. And so, because they lost, Marwan was effectively elected caliph at that point, and they quickly reconquered Egypt and Iraq from the Zubayrids. And I'm going to show you another clip from Hugh Kennedy here, video clip from Hugh Kennedy, and he's going to talk a little bit about that.
So Ibn al-Zubayr was defeated and killed. There was a more vigorous and dangerous proto-Shi'i revolt in Iraq. And somebody was asking about Ibn al-Hanafiyyah earlier today, the son of the Hanafite woman who was the half-brother, therefore, of Hassan and Hussein. And he seems to have not ever been to Iraq himself, but a whole body of Iraqi opinion settling around the figure of Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubaid, led the people of Iraq against Umayyad rule and so on. And the whole of Iraq was really lost to the Umayyads. But the Umayyads struck back. The Marwan I, and above all his son Abdul Malik, who I've talked about before, recovered the Umayyad position. And they recovered the Umayyad position. They were able to do that, I think, partly Abdul Malik was an extremely able man, as I probably suggested to you, with his administrative innovations and so on. They were able to do it because they had the wholehearted support of the Ahl al-Sham, or at least they came to have the support of the Ahl al-Sham. And whereas the people of, whereas Ibn al-Zubayr was, in the wrong place, so to speak, from a military point of view, and the people of Iraq, whereas often happened in the early Islamic period, very much divided into different groups. Fairly soon, the Umayyads, represented by Abdul Malik, the son of Marwan, which is why that group of Umayyads are called Marwanids, because Marwan was a cousin of Muawiyah, not a direct descendant, united the Ahl al-Sham, and it was the Ahl al-Sham that enforced Umayyad rule in Mecca and Medina and in Iraq. And the enforcer and the leader of the Umayyad power was this man Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. And I'll come to him a little more in a second. But the nature of the Umayyad regime changed. I stressed in talking about, when we were talking about Muawiyah, that we were looking at a sort of federal structure. Muawiyah made agreements with local Arab elites, and it was a decentralized system much more. What happens under Abdul Malik is that the Umayyads and the Ahl al-Sham conquer the rest of the Islamic world, basically. They conquer Mecca and Medina, and they conquer Iraq in a series of battles against the supporters of the Ahl Bayt, the supporters of the family of the Prophet, and also against the tribal leaders of Iraq as well, who are a different group, not necessarily Ahl Bayt, but people who came from the great Iraqi tribes of Tamim and Abdul Qais and so on. And there were a series of large-scale battles in which the Syrians took Iraq, and talking about the establishment of the city of Wasit. In a way, the Umayyad Caliphate changed into a Syrian military dictatorship, if you like. The tribes of Syria formed the elite of the army. They were the ruling class, they were the ruling group. And in Iraq, we get this continuing resentment against the dominance of the Syrians and the way that, and something important happens under Hajjaj. Hajjaj is a figure of the Umayyad period. He was the governor of Iraq and all the East. The Caliphate was essentially divided on unofficial basis between the Umayyad family, who ruled essentially Syria, Egypt, and points west, and Hajjaj, at least up to his death in 714, who ruled Iraq and all the East.
And Marwan's son, Abdul Malik, was named as heir to the throne. So Marwan declared that he was going to be heir to the throne. And Marwan married Yazid bin Muawiyah's widow. So Yazid bin Muawiyah, when he died, his wife was widowed. I can't really find the full name of Yazid bin Muawiyah's wife. I just see her, she's just mentioned like in Ṭabarī as Khalid. So that was, Khalid bin Yazid's mom. So not only did he win and he became caliph, and Khalid bin Muawiyah was not caliph, but he married his mother. So it's like a power play, right? And some say, well, maybe he did that to be political, to kind of gain support of the Qasis. But to me, it seems more like a power play. Like, look at this kid. He's still a minor. How could he ever be caliph? I married his mom. And Marwan's reign only lasted for about 9 months because he died shortly after becoming caliph. And the different historical sources kind of give different dates, but it seems like a lot of them say that he died in Ramadan in 65 Hijri, which is 685 Gregorian. And there's two different competing narrations as to how he died. So a lot of the traditional Islamic historians, they talk about that he was murdered by Muawiyah's widow, the mother of Khalid bin Yazid, or Khalid. One source says that Khalid hired, or basically commanded 5 of her slave girls to strangle him to death in his sleep, or to put some cloth in his mouth so that he would choke or suffocate. Another report from Ṭabarī reports that Khalid killed Marwan herself by suffocating him with a pillow. You know, their husband and wife sleeping in the same bed together. Marwan falls asleep and she suffocates him with the pillow, which is a common, theme that we see in even contemporary American movies now. So I guess that was something that existed even back then. And it's said that, the reason she did this was because he would always talk bad about Khalid bin Yazid, and talk bad about Khalid behind her back. So it's kind of hard to know really what happened. A lot of Orientalist scholars and some Islamic sources, they say that like al-Mas'udi, for instance, he says that Marwan died from a pandemic that was occurring at the time. And Ṭabarī, he does talk about this pandemic as being separate, though, from not Muawiyah, but from Marwan bin al-Hakam's death. Ṭabarī narrates that the pandemic, it started in Basra, and they called it al-Jarif. And so we're living in a pandemic right now. So I think we can all kind of understand what that must have been like. I mean, the Umayyad times in general seem quite chaotic, especially this early period of the Umayyads, this transition from the Sufyanids to the Marwanids. You have Ibn Zubayr, claiming caliph and having his little caliphate. You have the Khawarij, who are establishing, political kind of polities, or whatever you want to call them, dynasties, or their own caliphate, or, there's just kind of chaos and kind of widespread confusion. Khorasan seems kind of to be a little bit independent from a lot of this stuff, not entirely, but they're out in the outskirts of the empire, as well as a lot of the soldiers, in the Maghrib. And, things are just kind of, there's no stability. I think, despite even, what happened to Uthman and Ali, I think people kind of found that the Khulafa Rashidin, there was more stability with them, even though it was like rapid change and Islamic conquest. But the important thing here is from the, death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it seemed very tumultuous. A lot of chaos, a lot of warfare, a lot of moving, a lot of traveling, a lot of different competing, political entities, and not a lot of stability, really. I don't know what the daily lives of people were in that period, but it seems to be quite distressful. You got Karbala. The Kufans even tried to rebel with Ibn Hanafiya a little bit there, and that you had the Tawwabun from Kufa, which maybe we'll talk about a little later. But all these things going on here, just with these, you might say, 2 or 3 generations of Umayyads here, that really makes you wonder what was going on at that time, what people were thinking about, and how people felt with all the chaos. I mean, I can relate it to 2020. It feels like 2020, very, quite chaotic. Allahu A'lam what they were going through and what that meant for them. I think I'm going to conclude the video here. The sources that I used to make this video, I put below, in the description. So if you want to find that, you can go down there below. And if you buy, anything using those links, some of those proceeds actually do go to this channel. So I do encourage that, quite strongly. And you can find my link to my Patreon there, and so on and so forth. And thanks again for watching. If you like this video, please put a comment below, let me know, give it a like, and all those types of things. If you guys are not really into the political history anymore and you want something else, just put a comment below and let me know. You can always message me through Patreon, or email me. Emails in the About section on YouTube. You can find my Facebook page, or find me on Twitter, whatever, LinkedIn, whatever you want to do. And I'd be happy to talk with you. Thanks again for watching. Ma'as salama.